There's two myths. One is the Tower of Babel, which most people know about, and they think people didn't speak the same language, so that it was a casino, as the Italians like to say. Uh, but the interesting story here is the actual story from the book of Genesis. The text, the scriptural text, is that God or gods, whoever was looked upon man, and they were all speaking the same language, and they built this great Tower of Babel, and the a great tower. And the God said, "Well, if we let this go on, they can do absolutely anything if they can learn to speak the same language. So we're going to make them so that they don't speak the same language." And Prometheus saw this a couple millennia later and said, "Well, we're going to bring some fire to the humans so that they have some hope of learning the same language over again." And so, what we try to do in this session, but also generally in the Prometheus project, is to find some common language, because that is what gives us strength together as a society or socially. The other story is the elephant and the blind man. The meaning of this parable to me is that each of us sees a different part of the underlying complex reality, and we develop our stories and our language around those that what we see. And if we stay in that closed space, that's all that we learn about the elephant. But if we can learn to traverse some of those different disciplines and different perspectives, we can begin to see who the whole elephant is. So today, our guest with Alicia's been on this journey to understand both the philosophy and the science of the natural world. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong, Alicia. And from that, you can see patterns and structures and ideas that help us see how the natural world works. And so that's a way to see the elephant, at least one part of the elephant, but the elephant in general, if we're talking about the natural world. And so if we're talking about leaders and leading, we're talking about humans. We're also part of the natural world. We are natural systems. And so Alicia's insights into how the world works, the physical world, the material world, the natural world, gives us affordances for understanding leaders and leading. And that's some of what we want to explore today. Alicia, did that make sense to you at all?
Yes, that makes sense to me. Yes.
Cool. As we normally do, especially when we have a large crowd with some new folks coming in, we take a few minutes of an icebreaker where we will just put you into groups of 2 or 3, and just for 5 minutes or 7 minutes or so to meet each other. We usually give you a prompt. Our icebreaker prompt today, coming from our parables of what some of us see and some of us don't see, is what is something that you would like all of us to see, or more of us to see? So with that, Alicia, could you just introduce yourself? I mean, who are you? Why are you here?
Well, I'm here because you invited me kindly enough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. My background is in philosophy. I trained as an academic philosopher at the University of Miami in Florida. And if you know anything about philosophy, that means that I was trained as an analytic philosopher. And I guess I've been fighting that for a while. My interest was in intentionality. How do intentions cause behavior? And that led me to the question of causality. And that was what the first book, also by MIT Press, that was published in 1999, was about. That one's called Dynamics in Action. And then the problem of causality is a notoriously messy one. What is a cause? And it goes back to at least Aristotle. And then it got twisted around, it got changed a lot with the Industrial Revolution. And so when I ask myself, how does a family that you're embedded in, that you belong to, what's the mode of causality whereby the family influences what you think, what you believe, how you frame questions? How does a culture do that? Whether it is a social, I was born and raised in Cuba, whether it's a Cuban background, or whether it is an organizational culture. How do causes work? And they clearly don't work the way the scientific revolution, sorry, they don't only work the way the scientific revolution suggested, and that is kind of a billiard ball notion of causality where one billiard ball hits another billiard ball and imparts energy, and that works fine with billiard balls, but there is no energetic pushing physically that a culture does. Or, and what's amazing is, for example, the culture of an organization can outlive the particular employees and people there. So how does this all work? And so I kind of settled on another term, constraints, because I figured that would get me into less trouble, because mechanical engineers use that notion a lot, and that's not been a problem. So my question has been, how context, the book's called Context Changes Everything, How Constraints Create Coherence. And that was my question. How do constraints interact so that a culture emerges, a social organization emerges, any kind of collective dynamic? And so that took me to look at science, because philosophers aren't doing a very good job of that. And so I found systems dynamics, network theory, nonlinear dynamical systems theory, all that stuff to be a lot more interesting than what philosophers had to say about causes and effects. So here we are. That's me.
Yeah. Wow. So some of you who listened to some of the Prometheus framework way of thinking of leadership know that we talk about the leading part, what leaders do, in two spheres or two ways. One of them is they get results, they do things, which is kind of the causal circumstance that sometimes that you can, shoot the pool cue and get a result. The other piece, though, is that we say set conditions, and I think when we say those words, we mean what Alicia means when she says we may afford constraints in the organization, is that we are thinking about what are the constraints that are in place now, what are the constraints that we can potentially change or get agreement with for others to change that allow different things to occur that are occurring now. And I always go back to Alicia to say, police my wording. Did I say something that you see differently? Is that?
No. But then once we start looking at constraints, I think there are a lot of different kinds of constraints. And people are always giving me griefs about, you should have a typology of constraints. Yeah, maybe I should, but I'm not sure I can do it that quickly and that easily. But I think there are I think of two kinds of constraints: context independent constraints that kind of set the stage of a context, and they're independent only in the sense that they set the stage. And then the others are context dependent constraints. Then within context dependent constraints, I think there are enabling constraints. And that's an important distinction in the book, because in everyday language, we tend to use the word constraint only to mean limiting constraints. But biologists have used the notion of enabling constraints for at least 50 years that I think I can go back. People like Howard Patty, Stan Salty, Niels Eldredge, a whole bunch of the biologists have talked about enabling constraints. And what I mean by an enabling constraint is the constraints you put in place that create links, and thanks to those links, an emergent characteristic occurs. So imagine you've got threads. Think of a tapestry. In a sense, the components are the different wool threads, but it's the way they're organized and put together that all of a sudden you have an emergent property of an image in that tapestry. And so that's the kind of constraint I'm thinking about. So to me, a culture of an organization is that image on the tapestry. It's an emergent characteristic that is not something separate from the threads. The image is not separate from those threads. It's not a spatial-temporally separate, but it is a whole different set of relationships that give you the image. The image is a relational phenomenon. And to me, that's what an emergent property is. That's what a culture is. And I suspect that's what leadership qualities are, emergent properties. And the question is, how do they emerge? How do they coalesce? How does that happen?
Yeah, would you say that every use a phrase I can't there's a realizability is a phrase I think you use, but would you say that the leader's emerging, but also so is the context emerging? It's constantly changing. It's never fixed, right?
Correct,
It's always
correct.
responding.
And
Yeah.
that's why, as much as I love your images of the Tower of Babel and the elephant's pretty fixed for a short period of time. But the thing about dynamical systems and processes and events is that it's as if you are, what's the image people give? It's like you're trying to rebuild the boat while, or the plane while it's still flying. The terrain changes as you act, and then the terrain then acts back on the agent to alter their behavior. So it's a constant part whole, WHOLE, whole part relationship that's constantly changing. And that is another problem that the traditional Newtonian mechanical science is not very good. They're very good at understanding aggregation, but they're not very good at understanding how a coherence emerges. And that's what I'm looking at. And I think, for example, a culture is a beautiful example of a coherent dynamic. Meaning what? It hangs together in a way that a pile of debris in the dump down the road towards the airport doesn't hang together. The bits and pieces in that dump remain what they are, whether they're in the dump or not. But in an ecosystem, a species will change depending on the context in which it is embedded. A cell will act very differently depending whether it's in a petri dish or whether it's in a actual tissue. And so a lot of the studies that we've done in a petri dish suddenly don't translate into the tissue, because the tissue gives feedback onto the cell. And so I'm trying to understand how all of this causality interrelates, and it's all changing under you as you try to get your bearings, sort of.
Here's an image. Let's so how would you think about what we're looking at here, Alicia?
Well, I think the best model to always keep in mind are things like ecosystems. Whether it's a little pond, it doesn't have to be the humongous Amazonian basin. It can be just a little pond, but everything's interacting with each other, and some species are more fit than others. And I think this little image is an attempt to capture what people would call a fitness landscape. And so the question is, if you think of the border of that oval, and we have no choice but to do it that way, although boundaries and borders of complex systems are not nice, clean edges. They leach into the context and the environment leaches into it. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that boundary, that's what we're going to take for granted. And perhaps there are species, or in an organization, practices, protocols, organizational structures that are pretty fit for that context. And I would think that maybe the blue dots represent those. Now, you will notice that some blue dots are a lot lower than others. Those are called minima. And there's sometimes where you may think you're at the top of the heap, because you are at the top of that heap, but there might be a fitness peak that you can't see from that lower little summit you're at. And that would require that you negotiate the terrain. Maybe sometimes that would require you to go downhill a little bit before you can go back uphill a little bit. Then I think the green represent unfit conditions, unfit, it's not fit for purpose. Those probably are the green. Then the yellow would represent some of those yellows are on the bottom of the valley. Those represent that they are pretty stable. Others are towards the top and they might be pretty fit, but they might be more unstable fit conditions. The red would kind of almost be a dead end. That's the way I'd understand this dynamic. And so obviously if you're thinking about how do I change something I don't like? The first question is, where's my context? What's going on? Where am I in this landscape? What's going on all around me in this landscape? And how do you change things? See, for a Newtonian billiard ball notion, of course, you push the ball, well, if you're on any of the blues, it'll go downhill. You really cannot push the greens uphill. But the way that complex dynamical systems think of this is, can you change the conditions? So in a sense, you change the topology, right? So in a sense, if I'm in one of the green spots, can I either lower the cliff around me, or can I raise my own, the floor in which I am standing right now? So it gives me a sense of how do I change the constraints so that the topology changes and I can move from here to there. That's the way I would look at it.
So this is also, well, if the narrative was kind of the familiar capitalist story of, I say this is my organization that I'm in, right? And the blue is the desire for profit, and the green is the desire for the human experience or employee engagement or employee experience. And the two of those are both creating the landscape that the organization that's currently represented by this grid, this topography. So if the one is pulling one way, the other is pulling the other way, and they create some kind of flow or some kind of efficiency in the organization. Is that also a reasonable way to look at it?
That's also a very reasonable way of looking at it. Also, if you are in a leadership position, you have to look what the neighboring context is doing, because that might be coming your way. And so then the question is, how much adaptive space is left? See, in this case, that oval circle is very tight. It's very close to where you are. But what's going on in the rest of that frame that might be coming your way? And do you have the conditions that you can adapt to that new event, context, trend, new technology is coming your way? So the question, I think, also, if you're managing an organization, is how can I deform the edge of that context so that kind of the amoeba that took over New York, so that whole dynamic can move in the direction you are hoping will enable your organization to thrive.
Yeah. So you're going into the context interdependence type of piece of it. And so I'll just, in this picture here, this is, I think, showing one context and what you would refer to as context dependent, which are things that are within the context that you can change, that change the topography. But that's not the only context you're in, right? You're also you have contexts that have relationships to each other and that have overarching context, right?
Correct. And so then the question here would be, if I were in a position of authority in an organization that was responsible for this sort of thing, I'd ask myself, what are those two little green dots that seem to bridge, literally bridge, the two different contexts? And if I'm on the right and I want to get to the left, how can I widen that bridge? There's a Centola talks about wide bridges. I think it's Centola. Mark, is it Centola? I think it's Centola. He talks about wide bridges. Network theory tries to map these. See, network theory is, in a sense, one of the sciences that has, I don't want to say grew out of complexity, but it certainly uses, or complexity theory can understand what's going on a lot of times by looking at network dynamics. And so you have weak ties. We all know about weak ties and 6 degrees of separation, so on, or small worlds and that sort of thing. But there are also broad, wide bridges. And so to me, those are all forms of constraint. Because again, if you think of a bridge, suppose you're the leader of an organization, and what would be an enabling constraint that might make my organization a bit more resilient? And if you want, we can talk about the difference between stability and resilience that can make it more resilient. And that is, suppose you enter into an agreement with a different organization. That might be a way of establishing one of those bridges that will give you conditions and ideas and other enabling constraints that would improve your conditions, your adaptability, and so on. I believe there was an organization in New York a long time. It wasn't the Algonquin group. It was in the 1920s, long time ago. And their deal was, you could be a member, but there's only one condition. And the one condition is you cannot sit next to anybody you know. See, now that's not an efficient cause. That's not a billiard ball pushing situation, but it sets up the conditions that might create an enabling opportunity to have new dynamics emerge. I always said, if I were running a university, I'd change all the offices so nobody could have an office next to somebody in their same department. I probably wouldn't get very far. They'd kill me before I even got started. But that's one way to ensure evolvability. Not just adaptability. Adaptability, you're assuming things are more or less staying the same and you're just adapting to them. But evolvability is when the world changes around you. And that's where you really need leadership to be able to say, all right, here's where there's going to be you're going to go over this cliff. And how am I going to set up this organization so that I'll survive that cliff that's coming at me? And so I think these are nice examples of two different contexts, but also what gets you from one to the other, or what makes the transition or the accommodation, or the word that complex dynamical systems people use is evolve, or biologists, evolvability, the capacity to evolve. And I think that's a really critical thing that you did not have in Newtonian science, for example.
Entrenchment.
Okay. The question, go back to the previous slide. How does that all come into being? In other words, how does a context coalesce? It doesn't coalesce by putting a wall around it. You might have a clump of stuff inside a wall that has no coherence to it. So my question is, how does a coherent dynamic gel or coalesce? And if the answer is, well, it's not a wall, my answer was that once it gels, what has happened is there's and I don't know how other to describe this, a constraint regime has interlocked. a whole bunch of these constraints that went to organize this interlocked in that, under those conditions. And those interlocking constraints that I'm calling a constraint regime hold the dynamic together. And that's important. I think enabling constraints not only allow an emergent dynamic to emerge, to coalesce, but you need stabilizing conditions. And that's what I'm calling the constraint regime. A constraint regime are what I call constitutive constraints that hold the system together. Otherwise, it'll dissipate back into nothing. But the other alternative, instead of dissipating into nothing, these constitutive stabilizing constraints could entrench. What do I mean by entrench? Complex systems are always and only open systems. No closed system can be complex. A closed system can be complicated, but that's a whole different animal from complex. And if you want, I'll talk about that later on. So if a complex system is always open, that means it exchanges matter, energy, and information from the environment. But sometimes that exchange of matter, energy, and information somehow gets frozen in time. And so you're not really getting updates from what's going on around you, either from by nutrients, nor are you discarding waste into the environment. So that's what I call entrenchment. And it's interesting because you don't see much entrenchment in biology, because species will, be fluid. They're all pretty fluid. It's very hard to find an entrenched. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe the Sahara is nowadays entrenched, or large ecosystems like that. But certainly in social systems, you see entrenchment, and probably because human beings can deliberately fix that constraint regime. But that's what I mean by entrenchment, where the constraint regime has become so rigid, it has stopped being responsive to the environment. Question that some people are asking is, could PTSD and could this new interest in what's it called, ketamine, be refer to this sort of problem, that maybe PTSD is sort of an entrenched neuropsychological dynamic that has closed itself off from, look, I'm now in Kansas, I'm not in Afghanistan, I'm not in Iraq, so that the sound you heard isn't a bomb what's it called?
IED.
The IED device. It is, their neighbor's car backfiring. And so then the question would be whether these ketamines, are people interested in hallucinogens again, which is interesting so many years afterwards, that this might be a way of destabilizing the constraint regime to allow the constraints to reconfigure anew in a way that's more responsive to the environment. Interesting question is, what would be the equivalent of that in an organization? Probably a reorg, but a lot of times a reorg are nominal. They really don't reorg anything, in my opinion.
They're not fundamental. Let me just zoom out a little bit. So I think we're kind of saying that everything is a context. Everything is a constraint, energy in a constraint regime. And we can look at it in the micro, and we look at it in the macro. Is that fair?
I understand what you're saying. I tend to want to make a distinction between the plain old environment and the context. Because, for example, the example I always tend to use is a tsunami wipes out a village in Thailand. That can be clearly explained by an efficient cause coming in from the environment onto this beach town in Thailand and wiping it out. That is clearly explicable in terms of energetic transfer, old-time causes, efficient causes. But how how an ecosystem adjusts to its that's more an embedding phenomenon, where the events of the at the local level affect. See, let's use this example. What the team does is influenced by the operational context, but what it does will influence the operational context as well. See, whereas the earthquake at the bottom of the Marianas Trench or whatever trench in the Pacific that then hits, you get a tsunami that hits that village, there's really nothing in that village that the village can do to change that trench in the bottom of the ocean volcano that or earthquake that occurred. So there's no two-way street. Whereas in these examples, notice that grayish arrow that winds from the context, a team, up to the culture. And I would want to say then on the other side, loops back down from the culture through the executive context and operational down to the team. I'd say that to me is where I would use the word context, just to distinguish it from the environment where things can come at you from left field and affect and cause horrendous changes or beneficial changes. That's a different phenomenon, I think.
There are contexts like everywhere that are interacting with one another, and that they have internal or context-dependent constraints, and they have cross-contextual constraints that affect them or that they potentially can affect outside.
Right. But
interesting.
And they're different because the ones that go bottom up, that arrow on the right of that image, that's what I would call enabling. How did this organization come to be? Then you're coming from, a bunch of people got together in a restaurant, decided, let's start this organization, let's go register it in Delaware. And so you're starting literally from the bottom up, right? So I call those enabling constraints, because it's the working of the individuals within a context independent constraint like the market or the economy and so on, that then will create an operational context, correct? And the operational context in turn will produce an executive context. Think of the executive context not as separate from the operational context. To me, an effective operational context throws off, if you will, an executive context that reflects those dynamics. And in turn, all of these things going on in a society will produce a culture. So those are enabling constraints going bottom up. Now, what keeps each of these ovals together? Those are my stabilizing constitutive constraints, right? Now, what about that arrow I suggested that goes top down, from the culture down to the executive, operational down to the team? I call those governing constraints. And what those do is those modulate, regulate, change the timing, such that the culture will keep the executive context aligned with the culture. And the executive context will then tell the operational context or pass its own regulations that say, look, we need compliance because we've been just hit with a new law that says these organizations need to provide proof of compliance. So then the executive order will reflect that and will formulate measures of compliance that balance, adjust, harmonize the culture with the operation, and so on down the line. And so that, again, I'll repeat, that is why I like the biological metaphor so, because in a sense, it's a co-evolving, fitting together Unfortunately, we have come to think of survival of the fittest. That is probably flat out wrong. It wasn't even something Darwin thought of. Apparently, from all the biologists that I know of who and are historians of biology, apparently Darwin's notion of fittingness is a fitting together. Like, suppose you went to a tailor and you were being fitted for a new suit or a new set of clothes. It's a matter of tucking in here, pulling out there. How long do you want it? Shall I leave some extra so the hem be a lot larger in case you need it to let it out or not? It's a continuous mutual process of co-adjusting the constraints of the higher level with the middle level and the middle level, and all these levels working at the same time. And so that's the way I think we need to think of causality. We need to think of complex system dynamics, of which all living things are complex dynamical systems, dissipative structures. And I would hazard the guess, now some people are going to balk at this, that human organizations are all complex dynamical systems. I'm willing even to go to the next step and say the human mind is a complex adaptive system.
So, Alicia, a great segue from looking at context and constraints kind of at this macro scale to the other end of the spectrum of looking, down into, the little person down here. And so here we have this idea of the person, the leader, as we think of them as a thing, but I like to think of them as actually they're a set of context and constraints. For example,
Correct.
the mind,
Correct.
and that have cohesion and stability within.
Hopefully,
We have stability within the mind, but also emotionally in terms of our passion and purpose. That these are all different examples of dynamics that are in us that can be seen as elements or they can be seen together as a whole. And so when we talk in our framework, we talk about the leader, we really talk about these different sets of dynamics that are going on in the person, but also their embodiment of their knowledge and experience and skills that they bring to these outside context outside of themselves.
Philosophers of mind for a while back have been saying, for example, I can't remember when this paper was published. It was Thomas Nagel, I believe, and it's called "The Mind Ain't Just in the Head." And I think that's extremely important, that we thought the mind was identical to the brain. Well, as a matter of fact, it isn't, for a bunch of reasons. First of all, I don't know if you realize we probably have more neurons producing dopamine in the gut than we do in the brain. That's not quite right. There's an awful lot of neurons in the gut, and that produce dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter when it works in the brain, helps with digestion when it's in the gut, all right? But aside from that, it's not just in the human bodily organism. I've been charged with teaching some grandkids to parallel park. And because the parents are petrified and even the grandfathers are petrified, so I'm the go-to person to help teach them how to parallel park. And I try to explain to them, and you're driving in Georgetown here in town, which is a 18th century little town. It's very small streets, cobblestone, many of them still. And unfortunately, you have these humongous, I was going to say something else, humongous American SUVs. And so these kids are petrified. But I think all of us who drive have the experience of an embodiment of the person, so that I feel when you're driving that you extend to the edges of even the rear view mirrors on the side, and you kind of are able to navigate those very narrow streets with cars parked on either side, because somehow your driving constraint regime is smeared out into the environment in such a way that you know how to navigate it. That I don't think that's it's a silly example, but it's not really all that silly. I think we do that a lot. People whose identity depends on their heritage, in a sense, are doing the same thing going back in time. They are not only this organism born in this year, but in a sense, they are the extendedness of an entire cultural tradition, a family tradition, all sorts of things. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying, as long as we realize that that mind isn't just inside the skull. That a dynamical notion of a leader is somebody who literally can sense the condition of the organization vis-a-vis the context it happens to be in, and how it's modifying everything. So, and that's not easy. I don't think everybody can do that.
Yeah. So we sometimes, besides these symbols are nice because they leave a lot of room for us to create a story around them, which is a good thing.
Right.
But once in a while we create like tables and lists, which we can think of as very narrowly. We can think of this. We have an immediate reaction to think very concrete terms when we look at something in a list, but they're just ways to label these more dynamic underlying realities that we talk about. Besides the leader, there's stuff happening outside of the leader. There's these topographies that they can see, or that they can take action to influence or to change, either in some parts of it can be causal, but a lot of it is contextual, influencing the context rather than controlling it. They're not going to be able to do that.
I think it's also important to think of the leader as in those terrains, because what they will see is not necessarily what it is, not all of what is out there. They will see what their perspective, because they are embedded in that situation, that they will, and so they will miss a bunch of things. I mean, otherwise, why would anybody hire an outside consultant? And the reason for hiring an outside consultant is because perhaps if you're not embedded, you can only lead if you're embedded in it, but you may not be able to see everything that's there if you're, I don't know if the phrase is that close to it, because it's not even close, it's you're in it. You're not even close, but outside of it, you're in it.
Yeah, you can't stand outside and look at it objectively because you're enmeshed in
correct.
In
so
the
it's as if you're in the belly of the elephant. Correct. It's not even that you're outside with a bunch of ladders. I mean, that's a wonderful example. I wouldn't have known what else to use. The choices that they will be able to press will depend on what they see, and what they see. If you go back and look at those terrains, what they see depends on where they stand. Correct? You're in one of those valleys. You can't see what's on the other side of that valley. Correct? You have to go up to the summit in order to see what's in the next valley. And so I think that also one thing that epistemologists talk about when they look at complex dynamical system, epistemology is a branch of philosophy that looks at knowledge and perception. And where does perception become knowledge? Where does opinion become knowledge? And so on. And the thing is, you're always embedded in an interpretation. Somebody who's been with an organization forever has this vested interest, and their tendency will be to entrench everything. I'm available for questions. I'm always very flattered that practitioners are interested in this stuff. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's go around the room. I'm gonna just quickly, if you could move the conversation along, because we do have just about a half hour left, and there's hopefully lots of interesting questions. I have a couple of my own that I'll hold back for maybe the next session. But in room 9, Hibbs, Coyne, Kolomowski, Mackey, do one of you have something that you would like to bring up as a question or a challenge about all this?
I was
Oh,
waiting for my room colleagues to speak up, but they're being very
being
quiet.
sh they're being shy.
Um,
Well, go. Don't make us wait. Do your best.
no, well, my best is not going to be good enough, Tom, because I found it very hard to follow along. My newfound friends from room 9 tried to do their best to help me, but we ended up really talking about dogs and sweets and playing guitar, and it was.
There you go.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for taking my question. So, I've been puzzled a little bit about the order or sequence of the sort of the enabling constraints first coalesce a coherent dynamics, and then with the constitutive constraints sort of stabilize, and then maybe some even further persisted with some governing elements. And I was just thinking about the leadership aspects you talked about, Alicia. So, so sometimes, I observe leadership like bringing in new practices from the environment. I mentioned a few examples from my world. I work with software architecture, so things like team topologies and things like even agile frameworks such as SAFe. A lot of people have experience with, and then just in a way use that as a governing constraint to basically stir up an organization to say, oh, you're too entrenched, let's do something new. So that's one way of doing things. And then the other way is like I'm just puzzled, I know that's sort of not the right way because you're missing the enabling link, but then in the other sense, then you also break the entrenchment. You know what I mean? So there's this subtle like paradox in the leadership, intervention. How do you see that using this framework?
I think it depends on where you're coming into the problem, right? If there's a, I hate to repeat myself, but I use this example from Jean-Paul Sartre about people waiting at a bus stop, right? And these are disparate people. They don't know each other. They're just standing and waiting at a bus stop, but the bus is late. And then it's late, and it's late, and it's late. And then maybe they start talking to each other. And of course, language is the wonderful enabling constraints. And so a group coalesces, and oftentimes you may get one of the people there who say, well, I guess I know somebody in the transportation department. Maybe we can go complain that it's always this bus. This one, it happens to always be late. It happens too often. And that sort of. So then, you see what I mean? It depends. Are you coming into an established organization that already has a constraint regime? In this case, I'm supposing that the constraint regime is the society, but the little team, the little group that coalesces is a new thing, correct? And then so how would they say, well, let me see, I think I know how to contact that person. I'll write, would you all be willing to sign this petition? That's that sort of thing. So the leadership would emerge from the collective group, but that's very different from if you are hired by an organization that's been in existence for a while, and either as a new CEO or you're designated as a new manager for this division, and then how do you handle that kind of leadership? And there you would say, look, I know somebody from outside that has handled these kinds of problems doing it this way, and so that would be your example. They're bringing in, right, a different way of looking at things. So, and then the question is, you'd have to know if that new way of looking at things is compatible with that organization's culture, that their constraint regime, right? I think that's how you would do it. So whether it's enabling and whether it's governing depend on where you're coming into the, where you're coming into the situation.
My specific question would be, would it be possible or imaginable to think about a governing constraint? Sorry, excuse me. Being born first or introduced to disrupt the organization without an enabling process?
See, I would think of that more like an efficient cause. I would think of that more as an efficient cause. Somebody came out and said, I'm going to change this whole thing. So then they're in a sense, they're destroying the existing conditions and culture and so on. That's different. I think that's a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, that really explains.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
But it may not work. But
Correct.
it would be an example of an imposed constraint, a governing constraint that then you would expect the context to have to kind of reconfigure so that they can work, right? Or it would be probably cause chaos initially. You know, they would have to reconfigure themselves and come up with a new enabling constraints or a new constraint regime. People would have to step into that space as catalyst to try to reform that.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah. So we're back to the Twitter example again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Rose.
So in my group, great presentation, by the way, Alicia. I have not read your book, so coming from a place, but I'm now wanting to read it. We had Mark, we had Basir, and Michael. So I'll just give you the commentary, and you can choose what you would wish to comment on. So the first one was, why the use of the word constraint? For those who have led organizations or worked in organizations, the word opportunity was more, it enables whoever's leading to create create a space of more positive hope, that kind of thing. That was the first comment. The second one was about the example of the university, mixing up the university faculty and sitting in different places. That alone, you need something else. And so we got into this discussion about, collaboration, how to improve collaboration. And another example of a security agency was mentioned. And then the last area was constraints are always changing. And you probably cover this in your book, but again, it's not static. So, you mentioned government. When you're conceiving a proposal, the constraints are there, but when you go to implementation, the constraints would have changed. And then what do? You don't have the authority, you have to go back and.
Exactly.
So those were the comments, and Mark was very generous to share his perspectives. Appreciate that, but I'm sharing it with the larger group so that you could get a sense of what we talked about.
Thank you. No, obviously the just switching the offices around isn't going to do it, but I suppose that's the rationale behind the proverbial water cooler, right? That the idea would be that there would be a locus, a space, the opportunity for interaction, and that would probably have been a very, very good word that never occurred to me. I think I got the notion of enabling constraints from the biologists, and just the fact that it allowed me to do what the word cause didn't. But that's exactly what I'm talking. It's a space for the sort of interaction that isn't the Newtonian bumping and jostling that just dissolves after it happens, but that sort of remains as some kind of a link that you can then build on. I think that's extremely important. When organizations have a call for proposal with a X number of time, frame of and so on, and then they change the rules of the game between the fact that the proposal was awarded and when they're implemented, there is a horrible mismatch in the alignment between the constraints operating at this system at this level and the constraints operating at this level. That's exactly a beautiful example of a system getting out of kilter. in a sense, I would say. So those are really, really nice examples. I really liked all of those.
The question I have is, it seemed, and this was just my interpretation, it seemed like the majority of the book, and I've gone through it, I think 4 times now. I was telling someone earlier, the first read was about 6 weeks, and the most recent read was I'm down to a week. So I'm slowly sort of learning this material much better. But and it's a great book. Thank you for that. The question I have is this: it seems like a lot of the book is a buildup of sort of the enabling constraints, the phase transition, governing constraints, and sort of that whole dynamic. And I use constraints, by the way, in the work that I do is business transformation type of work, organizational change, to sort of manufacture a phase transition to hopefully a better state. And that's largely what I do. But the thing that I've been sort of curious about, doing a lot of reading recently on sort of resilience thinking and ecosystems and kind of the tie-ins with complexity and constraints. I've been curious about like the early stage formations of organizations from sort of that from that sort of emergence of the organization, talking about starting a company in a coffee shop, all the way to the conservation stage of the adaptive cycle.
Exactly.
And it seems to me like in that sort of early stage phase, all the way through conservation, that you don't have well, maybe you do have governing constraints, but a phase shift hasn't occurred. You've got sort of the original idea of the company, and then you've got some over time sort of the layering in of constraints to kind of formalize and mature the organization. But and then and so I was curious to know, like, what does that look like? And then I read for the first time, I really got it on page 24 of your book. It says that some constraints enable phase transitions to coherent dynamics with emergent properties, which is largely the work that I do. But then you say, but others lay down the coordinates of possibility space itself. They establish the boundaries of what is possible and what is not. And so that was my question to you. Is it seems to me like in that early growth stage of a company, it isn't so much about initiating or trying to create some sort of phase transition, because it's just not relevant. It's more about laying down the coordinates of the possibility space. And I was just wondering,
Like the
is that how
frame.
you think about it?
I think so. And I think that's probably why some younger people find working at a startup a lot more attractive. There are fewer governing constraints and constitutive constraints, and things are still a lot more fluid. And I can really make my mark here. I can really steer the situation into the direction I want. Problem comes when the organization is already a lot more mature, and then you've got some cockamamie leader who's running it like it was his own startup. Fill in the blanks as you will, right? And I think that's the issue. And so initially, I would assume you're in the coffee shop, but you're operating within a particular social society framework of some sort. So that's just a space of what is possible, what is not possible. And then once you've got that established, then the question is, what are our expertise? And that gives you another context dependent constraint that starts building the system in general. And then on the other far side, you've got the problem that came up earlier, and that is, how do you stop the thing from becoming entrenched?
Okay, Dave.
I want to build on that. I thought one of the things you said, Alicia, in your responses to Tom, was that a leader develops this sensibility of the context and all the dynamics thereto pertaining. And I think that's our mission, is to help each person become even more aware of the importance of all this going on. I think we're born that way. I think you watch a baby, they're figuring out their context constantly and testing their boundaries. I think we're natively able to deal with this complexity. I think we've kind of talked ourselves into saying, well, let's just keep it simple when we shouldn't.
No, that,
So maybe we've got to believe in what Paul said in my group, which is put some people together in a room who share responsibility, whether they like it or not, and don't let them out until they figure out how to do something differently. In other words, everyone already knew. They were just holding it back. So,
I'll throw the question back at you. How important is the physical presence? Because you wonder, biologically, we are built in such a way that we can read nuances in people's expressions in a way that we cannot do that otherwise. And
yeah,
it's funny because I always say I couldn't teach this if I couldn't go like this. You know, you get a feel for it.
yeah,
Get a feel, and people who are even programmers will say, I can tell that person wrote that program because I can see. What is it that you see? I don't know. It just looks like so and so. I can see their signature in that program. There was a teaching and learning mode, which was apprenticeship in the Middle
right,
Ages.
exactly.
And I don't think we do that as much. I understand the Germans do have a very strong apprenticeship program, but we in the United States do not. And you wonder to what extent that would be one model that would, why? Because the feedback loop is a lot shorter and you're seeing it and it's not, and if you're touching it and you're looking at it and so on, and you've got multimodal feedback loops that are short.
Yeah. I think that the closeness, the presence activates more of these sensibilities that I'm talking about. We hold some back because we're behind a screen.
Correct.
But in a future organization challenge, I believe, is getting people back together again, after the pandemic has knocked us apart. And yet at the same time, being appreciative that right on this screen right now, we have someone in England, someone in Asia, and this is, I don't want to give that up.
No, absolutely.
But maybe we can talk to Zoom about making it even more tactile in the future.
And we have to, and for that, I think we need an understanding of what dynamic equilibrium is.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're used to the old time notion of equilibrium, where an equilibrium is the ball on the bottom of a valley. Whereas equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, is somebody doing wheelies on a bike on a very rough terrain. That is and they can leave put their feet up in the air and the balance, because it's a whole different understanding of equilibrium, of balance far from equilibrium.
Right.
And we're either too enamored of the notion of stability, and ain't no stability for complex systems. If that were the case, that's dead. That was Humberto. Do you all remember the book called Foucault's Pendulum way back when, right? The whole idea of a pendulum will be stable in that old-fashioned sense when it's dead in the middle, correct? And no live thing has that kind of stability, correct? It's the dynamic equilibrium that we need to learn how to embody, how to enact, how to appreciate, and not try to pine for the old time stability where things that's A, unlikely to happen, and B, that's boring. in any case, it's boring, right?
Yeah. So this question of can we create that resonance or tacit communication separately from a place of distance is really the theme of the next session with Luca Delata. So we don't have an answer, by the way, but we think it is an essential question.
No, because if it's context dependent, you can't have one answer, correct?
Yeah.
The person who does the wheelie is a different person than one who's on the tightrope up between two high rises with 20-mile-an-hour winds blowing them in all sorts of directions, and yet they maintain their balance. And so each one is a unique skill that's very context dependent.
So let's jump to Vishva.
So I have the question framed a little bit differently, and it might be personal. because that's where you're most context aware.
Sure.
So you might have children, and how would you interact with them with your understanding of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and present understanding of
9 grandkids. I have 9 grandkids. And they ask me what do you do about college? I say, my only advice is pick options that give you more options. Options that open up more options. If you pick this option that looks ideal, but it only is ideal under these conditions, that's probably not a very good idea nowadays.
And would you have said that 10 years ago?
No, probably not. Or 50, 25. No, yeah. People assumed that there was a lot more old time stability and therefore you could plan long term. But what you're trying to do is, what is it that gives you the resilience to manage the different options? And I think that's what I would suggest.
So Istvan, love to hear your question or your comment.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Let me find my question. Yeah, sorry, I posted here. Yeah, so we were talking about this identity change, that identity is also context sensitive. And yeah, basically our question was that how has the shift towards remote work in the tech industry influenced the way people perceive and express their identities, considering the absence of like traditional office rituals,
Right,
dressing up, commuting, physical office meetings,
exactly.
etc. So yeah.
And I'm glad you said identities,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's all multidimensional. And maybe we dismissed and ignored other aspects of ourselves before when we were so focused on but it's always a constantly shifting balance. And I make a distinction between identity and individuation. Because I think my identity as a human being, as an organism of the member of this species, that's pretty stable. But am I the same individual that was the case 30 years ago? Not at all. And I think of that as those landscapes that Tom showed. I think by and large, with a newborn, has a lot more of a gentle landscape. Whereas as people get older, that landscape becomes increasingly rugged. They become increasingly themselves, and uniquely so. And I call that individuation. So I think that's a valuable distinction, in a sense, because individuation is irreversible over time. You can't kind of go back and erase the last 20 years of your life and then start again, correct? But that also means that you have that particular landscape that is you. And I'm not saying you are in, but that is you. All those multidimensional attractors and fitness peaks, and then maybe not so fitness valleys, or whatever way you want to look at it, that those give you a perspective and an insight that, if you appreciate that complex systems are by nature diverse, that their resilience is based on their diversity. And if you have any question about the biology of that, go back and look at C.S. Holling, Holling, Buzz Holling, who did the study on the Great Lake ecosystem, which seemed to have lasted forever until it all of a sudden started falling apart. And he did the study and he said, the Lakes ecosystem was very stable, but it had very few species in it. And stability, these biologists define as they don't vary much in oscillation. So they're very stable. An oak tree is stable compared to a banana plant that will do this, right? Very stable. But once it's stressed past that range of tolerance, gone, right? So Buzz Holling was the first to realize that an ecosystem, if it starts losing its diversity, its whole constraint regime starts falling apart. And diversity doesn't mean more individuals. It means different types of individuals. Because, and again, so if an individual is that particular landscape, by having different kinds of people in your organization, you'll bring a different perspective. Different way of saying that is they will be able to explore the adaptive space in a way that if you had only one or two types of people, never would occur to them to go to that corner. That sort of thing. So I think that's extremely important, but the balance is hard to achieve. Aristotle said the golden mean isn't just isn't just the average. It is the golden mean of their dietary intake. If you're the wrestler in the Olympics, is very different from the scholar.
Basir, you were next. Please go ahead.
Hi, Alicia. A great presentation, and I'm very much ashamed for not having read the book. Promise to read it multiple times. My question is on constraints, as in to overcome them. Collaboration, engagement. I'm in crisis management.
Absolutely.
I mean, both the pandemic and also counterterrorism always teaches us a lot.
Absolutely.
We're always for pro transparency. So in a way, when you have the constraints, is it diminishing or destroying agency? Look, when you think of the agency,
I think enabling constraints empower agency.
yes.
Then constitutive stabilizing constraints stabilize agency. Governing constraints, I would say, if I intend to write a book and it takes me 2 damn years, 3 damn years to do so, I would hope those governing constraints would maintain and preserve that agency. That said, I think it's very easy for it to tip into entrenchment, into destabilization, into all sorts of other things. So that's always a challenge. And I think the answer is always context dependent. So I think it's got both sides, yeah.
Anyone else have one more question before we end?
The group I was in with Yulia and Xin Yao and Houghton, was that a plea for not forgetting temporal constraints, and the question was there, how do we manage the psychological insecurities that all these myriad constraints burden with? Are we capable of thinking of that? And of course, the whole geopolitical situation in Ukraine and elsewhere about how do you get people to be able to not block these complex problems and try to pretend they don't exist? And that's a very difficult question.
Okay.
I think just 15 seconds. I think there's also weapons grade disinformation and cognitive assaults and so forth going on. So, your job is a lot more difficult because a lot of interference.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. In the interest of time, sorry to cut this short. Alicia, thank you again on behalf of the group.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. This was
a great
fun.
discussion, and
I've
coming to many of these sessions, I've never seen so many people, and so many people stay behind. So that's a great sign. And I hope everyone reads your book, and we're going to follow you for sure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. I'm going to end the session soon.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you. For me, it's afternoon, but for you, maybe.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.